right, don't worry.
Trooper. Right, here we are. Hello and welcome to the Whitehall Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics and policy making at Westminster. I'm Calum Macdonald. Hello. And also on the podcast, Kirsty Buchanan, who was a special advisor to the Prime Minister Theresa May. Hello, Kirsty.
Hello to you.
And Joe Tanner, political strategist who advises politicians from all political parties when they listen. Hi, Joe.
Hello. Not today, though, because I'm feeling poorly.
Yeah, well, thank you for still doing the pod. We've enticed Joe out of bed to chat to you on the podcast today. So thanks, Joe.
It means you two have got to, you've got to be even more sparkling than you normally are.
Well, if there's one thing we can do, it's sparkle, isn't that right, Kirsty?
Oh, I sparkle for days, darling. Sparkle for days.
Thank you for finding us. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app so you get every episode dropping into your feed every week. You can watch us on YouTube as well. Search for Whitehall Sources. Find us on X for all of our clips and on TikTok where you can leave comments as well. Coming up on the podcast today then, the winter fuel payment U-turn has begun. As of this lunchtime, it's been hanging in the air for a little while, and now we are, well, I would say at least halfway around the shape of the letter U, I think, at this point. Details to follow. And also we're going to be discussing the UK-EU reset deal. Who's won, who's lost, and what happens next. Spoiler alert, probably quite a lot still to be confirmed. We'll be joined by a former Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Kirsty, before we get started, I know that you wanted to mention Patrick O'Flynn, who sadly died this week.
Yes, thank you. So Patrick O'Flynn was a former colleague of mine at Express. He was a political editor there for many years. He died at the age of 59 of cancer, no age at all. And as we're all beginning to talk about Brexit again and the kind of ramifications of Brexit still filtering through our society and filtering through our public discourse, I've been reflecting on, Patrick was an ardent Brexiteer, a dedicated campaigner for Brexit, but I never heard him once discuss it or debate it in any other way than one that was respectful of the opinions of others. He was a really insightful and thoughtful writer, a very generous work colleague with his time and help and support. And it is a great loss to politics and to journalism. And I just wanted to send our thoughts out to his family at this time.
Absolutely. Hear, hear. Agreed.
Hear.
Thank you, Kirsty. This is the Whitehall Sources podcast. You can, of course, keep in touch with us to agree, to disagree, to ask questions and to offer your comments. You can WhatsApp us. The number is 0333 404 6507 and start your message with the word Whitehall. So the Prime Minister has announced a U-turn on the winter fuel payment for pensioners, saying more older people will be eligible than currently are. The new plan is expected to be announced in full in the budget in the autumn. Here's the Prime Minister speaking earlier.
We all know the economy was left in an absolute mess by the Tories. We had to stabilise the economy with tough decisions, but the right decisions. Because of those decisions, the economy is beginning to improve. Those growth figures last year, the highest growth in the G7, interest rate cuts, 4 in a row, 3 trade deals. But I recognise that people are still feeling the pressure of the cost of living crisis, including pensioners. And as the economy improves, we want to make sure people feel those improvements in their days as their lives go forward. And that is why we want to ensure that as we go forward, more pensioners are eligible for winter fuel payments. As you would expect, Mr. Speaker, we will only make decisions we can afford. That is why we will look at that as part of a fiscal event.
That's Sir Keir Starmer. So the cut limited the payments of either £200 or £300 a year to pensioners in England and Wales who receive means-tested pensions credit. It also only applies to those with lower incomes, or incomes lower, I should say, than around £11,800 a year for a single person or £18,000 for a couple. Kirsty, the thrust of what the Prime Minister was saying there is, we are doing so well, we can justify a U-turn. I can see you already laughing. Kirsty, can they legitimately claim that they have turned things around enough that this is simply a virtuous decision as a result of economic decisions that have resulted in things going in the right direction?
Well, I'm not sure what economy Keir Starmer is referring to, but it's certainly not the one that I can see at the moment, where inflation has just gone back up to 3.5%, and our economic forecast for growth has been halved for this year. So, I mean, I'm all for a bit of glass half full, but I think, and dare I say that this is a bit of a cynical note, I doubt very much this would be happening had it not caused such an outrage at the ballot box, at the local elections, and to every Labour MP who can brave talking to any constituent at any given time on any given day. This is, without a doubt, the biggest misstep Labour has made since it came into office. It kind of fell out of the sky, remember? And I think they were so determined to say when they came into office, everything is terrible, we need to make really tough choices because we've inherited such an appalling legacy on the economy from the Conservative government. Everything is awful. We've got this £22 billion black hole. And to demonstrate their desire for toughness, this is what they kind of plucked out of the air as their kind of opening gambit. Now, dare I say, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. And boy, has that had cut through on the doorstep. So I don't think he's fooling anybody that this would have happened had it not caused such an outrageous kind of backlash amongst both the commentariat. It's his Labour MPs and constituents. Having said all that, Joe, I don't know if you saw PMQs today.
I did indeed.
It was remarkable. A, for the U-turn, and B, for the fact that the leader of the opposition, Kemi, Badenoch, didn't notice it. She'd asked him a question about it. He answered in effect saying, yes, we're going to look at the next fiscal event, i.e. the budget in the autumn, at seeing whether more pensioners can qualify for it, which is basically confirming the U-turn. She then went on to ask about potential tax rises in the budget, which he didn't answer. And then curiously, she went back to asking him, can you confirm yes or no whether you're going to make a U-turn on winter fuel allowance? And I thought, have I missed something? Or did he literally not just do that a couple of questions ago? So...
but that was classic Kemi, that she had a plan and she didn't have a backup plan, because this is what happened. So Sarah Owen, the Labour MP Sarah Owen, queued it up with a question about pensioners. This was all pre-planned, but then Kemi kind of went in and had obviously decided this was the issue because there's been so much speculation. She just didn't have anywhere else to go other than to just keep pressing, the bruise or whatever we want to call it. But actually, I read a couple of commentators on X saying, Kemi had a great PMQs. And then I think a few others then thought, no, hang on a minute, I've just realised what actually happened. So in some respects, the Tories are sort of almost suggesting that Kemi helped elicit this, but actually it was all pre-planned with the question from Sarah Owen. And, this is... I've already said a few times that I don't think Rachel Reeves is going to be around to deliver the next budget. And I think it's really interesting that you've had this note from Angela Rayner that accidentally got leaked, mysteriously ended up in the Telegraph. Oh, wonder how that happened.
So this was the one where she was making the case actually for big tax increases, 8 potential tax rises, reinstating pensions lifetime allowance, higher corporation tax to raise £3 to £4 billion a year.
Yeah, and so you've got this intervention from the Deputy Prime Minister. You've then got the Chancellor herself is not in the country, which has, real echoes of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. And then you have this statement that they've clearly pre-planned. Now, I've spoken to a few people recently who have said that the welfare rebellion is growing massively, and the sort of the heat that the Labour leadership are feeling off the back of the sort of pressures that Labour MPs are sort of referring to and saying that they're seeing directly from their constituents. It's interesting that we've had this intervention. We've also, on the same day, we had the Department for Work and Pensions Secretary going pretty much doubling down on the changes that are needed to welfare because we've got this huge bill. And so it's almost like there's some sort of trade-off going on, that they've decided winter fuel is one they're going to have to reverse or at least change significantly, and then allow Liz to sort of carry on the route that she's on. But the concern is really who's in control. What are they actually doing? What is the narrative? And to your point, Kirsty, this whole thing was set up when they came into government to show that they could make the hard decisions. And a few months in, they're having to reverse it because it not only surprised the hell out of their own side and everybody else, but it played so badly. And now you've got a situation where even the Chancellor is not around to talk about it and to put her point. And to your opening question, Calum, about the economy, absolutely. Keir Starmer stood up today like a Prime Minister who hadn't noticed the inflation figures that were announced this morning. It was almost like interestingly, PMQs was like two individuals, Kemi and Keir, starting off with pre-prepared scripts that had not actually been modified based on anything that had happened overnight or this morning. It was really interesting. They just they played out what they'd both planned, which there was a distinct mismatch there.
And what this teaches the Labour backbench is if they apply enough pressure, their government will crumble. So what you've ended up with is a government that has endured maximum amounts of pain for a complete political misjudgment, has capitulated in the face of pressure, but capitulated in a way that is unlikely to win them any kind of plaudits on the doorstep, and has emboldened a very large backbench, which is very difficult to control because you just don't have enough jobs to go around, as it were. And I don't think it's much of a leap to say that all they will do is shift from this to the battle over PIP, which is part of these £5 billion welfare cuts that are there apparently in part of a larger package to get people back into work. And PIP, as we all know, has nothing to do with whether you're in work or not. It's about supporting independent payments. So my guess is that they'll probably now move on to PIP as their next kind of target. And we shall see on that. As for Kemi, look, this is the week where the Conservatives have slipped, one poll into fourth place behind the Liberal Democrats. I have talked to a lot of people over the last 2 weeks. There seems to have been a shift within the party away from not if they replace Kemi Badenoch, but when they replace Kemi Badenoch. There's also clearly some within Boris's camp on manoeuvres. I don't think, again, it's any surprise that all of a sudden Boris, with his gift for cut-through, is beginning to surface again, just reminding people, look, I'm here and I'm an alternative should the ball come loose from the back of the scrum brackets again. So I think there's very interesting things going on there, and I thought it was an extraordinarily bad performance by her, almost to the point where I just wanted to sort of scream, make it stop, at the television. It was so painful to watch, and I don't think that will have done her any favours at all. So look, I don't think this is a sort of a big winner day for either Labour or the Conservatives. And
I would argue, though, Kirsty, there was something about Keir Starmer that was interesting. That on his official page on X, there was a video of him walking out of Number 10. And it was, I can't remember the phrase that was used on the picture, but there was something about almost kind of, work to be done or something, stepping up, not standing aside. And it was a picture, I was not walking out of Number 10, I think it might have been walking out of Lancaster Gate or something, but it was a picture of him at a sort of big moment. And it sort of had a little bit of drama about it. Then there was this quite bullish start from him about the economy and where they're at. And this is on a day when he is announcing a significant turn in policy which has dogged them. And that, what I thought was interesting was his body language did not look like somebody who was feeling the pressure in that sense, because he made a very off-the-cuff remark about Nigel Farage not being present for his question, and that actually it was someone else, I think it was Lee Anderson, standing in for him. And he made a quip about Nigel wanting to be the first through the e-gates, which is obviously not true about where this deal is, but it was a good joke, and it's been remarked upon already online. But I thought it was interesting that I wonder if there was a sense for him of maybe a degree of relief that they've been talking about doing this, and perhaps they are as close to a plan to do this change to winter fuel. And maybe he thinks he's therefore bought off some significant group. But also telling was that Angela Rayner, who was the person that then had this memo that accidentally emerged into the Telegraph, where was she sat for PMQs? Right next to him. And that's quite interesting about what's going on in terms of within the party and personalities.
Can I add to this then, the thoughts, just to pull together a few things. So perhaps the government has misstepped in trying to look strong, but actually coming across as looking mean. And so the other areas to consider here are PIP and indeed two-child benefit cap. And so there's a thought in that, isn't there, that actually will they have to move on these other measures and to mitigate some of what they have already decided in all of that? Will there be changes there? Is there a problem? Is it unfair for people? And with that in mind, is there ever any way to get credit for a U-turn? Because some could look at this and say, well, at least they've come to the right decision at the end of the day, although there are still questions about whether this will all change in time for the coming winter. There are questions about exactly how it will be done. If you wait until the autumn budget, is it going to be too late? Payments go out in November, December. There needs to be some sort of overhaul of the current system if it's going to then, if the government wants to assess the income of pensioners, if that's how it's going to do this sort of U-turn, that then takes time.
And they've elongated the debate on it, Calum, because they haven't got any answers. They've just said we're going to be looking at it, and there's been this fudge.
The budget.
You know, the fact that there's been the debate that's been going on for the weeks that we've had about whether they are going to change the threshold, how it was being looked at. No, it's not being looked at, said Number 10. Oh, well, funnily enough, now it is being looked at. But actually what they've then done is they've sort of opened the floodgates to a bunch of questions that then Labour MPs can't answer. The government can't answer because they've said they're not going to actually make a decision till a fiscal event. Well, when is that going to be? You can only assume that is the official fiscal event would be in the autumn, unless there is some plan to do something significantly earlier, which is not on the cards that anyone can see. So that in itself is problematic. So, I personally think U-turns are very welcome. I think it's better to do something else rather than stick with something that doesn't work. I mean, Blair was it Blair that made a fairly quick U-turn on tuition fees into his time, and it wasn't disastrous for him in terms of where they got to. Sometimes you just have to say it's not working. But I still think the bigger issue is that you had a chancellor that hung her hat, her coat, every pair of shoes and suit that she was given by anybody else, and probably what else she still had, and the kitchen sink on this policy, and suddenly it's being changed. And I just don't think that is good for credibility for a chancellor that is supposedly going to take us through very difficult economic times. I don't know how that she lasts through a significant period of this Labour government. I can't see it.
I don't disagree with you on the fact that if you're going to U-turn quickly. I think if you're going to rip a plaster, rip it quickly. I think this is the worst of all U-turns. Let's say you've extracted maximum amount of pain. You've held on to this insanely unpopular, mean-spirited policy where the first action you've decided to do is give pensioners a good old kicking with their winter fuel allowance being taken away from them. You've held on to that for, month after month after month, and then you finally capitulated is the worst way to do it. And because you tied your original argument and rationale for doing it to the economy and said things are so bad that we have to do this really tough thing, you're now in this completely facile argument of saying, oh, well, because the economy is better, we can now look at bringing it back again. Well, one, that ratchets up expectations in as much as Ed Davies said, well, are you going to bring it back in full? So we will have month after month after month of ministers being asked well, if you're going to bring it back, are you going to bring it back in full? And if the economy, we live in hope, picks up, that kind of pressure only increases. If the economy slides down again, then you've completely obliterated all your rationale for this in the first place. It was either because the economy was bad and now it's better we can. You know, unprecedented, unforeseen events are kind of par for the course these days in politics. Inflation figures now at 3.5%. As far as, economic modelling goes, that'll actually increase towards the end of this year. We're beginning to see vacancies, unemployment rise again. It is an incredibly tough job market out there. And yet your rationale is going, things are much better in the economy, so we can give you back a bit of your winter fuel allowance. You're not going to get the credit. You're not going to get the cut through on it. You've taken maximum pain on it. And your rationale for your U-turn is BS.
And interestingly, I saw something on X. Sorry, I feel like I'm quoting a lot of what I saw online, but you can tell I wasn't feeling very well earlier, and so was sort of busy scrolling while watching.
Doom scrolling.
I was in bed just doom scrolling and also watching PMQs. But interestingly, Natasha Irons MP, in response to Kemi Badenoch saying the Tories will reverse Keir Starmer's deal with the EU, she said, and I thought this is great, when you're no longer queuing to get back into your own country and you're paying less for food at the supermarket, remember that Kemi thinks those things are bad. Now, what's interesting there is, firstly, queuing back into your own country is not relevant with the EU stuff because that's not about our gates at our airports, right? That's a different issue altogether. And secondly, what happens to you talking about cheaper food when inflation's going to be on the march? Like it then means that you've hung your hat on something you're only actually in control of a section of that. And actually we've established already we're not in control of it because part of that is subject to what else is going on in other countries and where we get to with the EU deal that was struck anyway. So much of this is variable that I think there's almost the idea that the government have sort of suddenly decided that they're feeling quite pumped by a couple of indicators and a couple of good conversations that suddenly everything's all right. We've averted job losses at Jaguar Land Rover. All of this stuff there's so much of it is not concrete. So much of it is still subject to significant more conversation and negotiation that I just feel like, again, this issue of promising quite a lot for people and then massively under-delivering. And I think we've talked a lot in politics. We've talked a lot about assessments after elections, about, how people feel in their pockets, what they feel in their pockets, whether they feel things are different. And the crux of that point about whether you feel differently, whether you feel better off, is all based on your expectations in the first place. It's all based upon where you think you should be and whether you're anywhere near that. Well, who tells you where you should be? It's the bloody politicians. And if the politicians are going to oversell everything, well, funnily enough, come the next election, everyone's going to be really pissed off that they don't feel that they're where they thought they were going to be because of the dream they were sold that actually was never achievable. So I am worried about, we've gone from doom mongering last year to everything being so terrible. Promises in the election, it's all going to be great. Oh my gosh, we've got in and it's all terrible. And now all these grand claims being made off of pretty, like I said, jelly nailed on jelly, really. And I just think this is going to be where we see this mass exodus of voters to other parties. I don't think it will be Reform winning votes. I think it will be people being fed up with mainstream politics lying to them. And I think we should proceed down that road at our peril. Sorry, I've suddenly got some energy there. I don't know what happened. One of the medicines must have kicked in.
You're quite right, Jo. Thank you both for such a helpful conversation on winter fuel U-turn. We'll be talking about it for months, as we're saying, because it won't happen until the autumn. That's probably when we'll get more info, because this government appears to be excellent at communicating things. And so we'll talk about it for the next few months. Still to come then on this podcast, we are going to discuss the EU-UK reset deal. In the next few minutes, you'll hear from a former Parliamentary Private Secretary to Boris Johnson. So do stand by for that. And let me just tell you, the word betrayal might come up in conversation. That comes next on the Whitehall Sources podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Whitehall Sources podcast. Right then, 4 years after Brexit, the EU and UK have announced a reset of their relationship with a 3-part deal. The new agreement aims to foster cooperation on security and defence and improve trade in agri-foods and electricity. The original post-Brexit trade and cooperation agreement is now being superseded by these new commitments. To join this part of the conversation, we've got Alexander Stafford, former Conservative MP and former Parliamentary Private Secretary to Boris Johnson and Kemi Badenoch. Alex, welcome to the podcast.
Hello there.
Great to see you. Thank you for being here. I suppose let's start here. So Keir Starmer says this reset deal will boost the economy by £9 billion a year by 2040. The flip side of that is analysis that suggests actually this will only be a tiny fraction of the costs of Brexit. So Alex, in your view, can we start with winners and losers of Sir Keir Starmer's version of Brexit and reset?
Yeah, there's one clear winner, and that's the EU. There's no question about it. The EU is getting pretty much everything they wanted and more. We're getting, frankly, I don't know what, and what benefits we are getting. You mentioned maybe the Erasmus scheme, there are costs attached to that, so we're going to be paying for the privilege as well, or other benefits such as slightly faster access potentially through e-border gates. We have to get individual country agreements as well. So frankly, I don't really see what the UK is getting out of it at all, but there's an awful lot for the EU to get out of it. So I think this is a great victory for the EU, and they'll be rubbing their hands with glee.
Yeah, it's interesting. So then, I suppose we come to some of the finer details on it. So this veterinary agreement between the two sides, arguably the most significant part. We'll come to fishing in a second. But this is to reduce the need for checks and certificates on animal and plant products. So it reduces red tape. This feels like a good thing.
Yeah, reducing Brexit is going to be, there's going to be a beneficial to some people and to some supermarkets, and we'll see what happens come to prices. But what is important is we are paying for this cost, and more importantly, we'll have to be aligned with the EU rules and regulations, and we don't really have a say in what's going on. And this really is the nub of the problem with this deal is we have to do what the EU says, but have zero impact now about the rules are being made. Now, I campaign for Brexit. I vote for Brexit. I believe Brexit was and still is the right thing to have happened. But I can definitely see the logic of saying, well, if we're taking the rules of the EU, but we have zero impact now of actually how they're being made. At least when we were a member of the EU, we did have some, albeit I'd say very small, impact on how those rules are being said. So we literally are having the worst of all worlds now. At least when we were in, we could have some say over it. We are not getting any benefit now, and that to me is a great concern. And a cynic in me would say this is exactly what Keir Starmer and elements of the Labour Party actually want. They want, frankly, the Brexit deal to be so bad, and it is, so that people like me who campaign for Brexit actually was better off when we were in. And that's the sad thing. This deal is pushing us to that situation.
To what extent, Alex, does this go some way to fixing some of the problems of Brexit? So loads of businesses have reported, here's the Food and Drink Federation, for example, saying that food and drink exports to the EU have fallen by more than a third since 2019 because businesses have been really struggling, actually, to meet the bloc's requirements. And that is not for a lack of Conservative Prime Ministers trying to deliver Brexit, but there is an acceptance across business that it has made life very difficult. This is trying to fix some of that.
There clearly has been some friction, has been over the last couple of years, with trading certain goods, certain services with the EU. And anything we can do to reduce that is good. But the whole point that Brexit was sold and should be sold wasn't just looking at the EU, but looking at the world, the global market as a whole. And what we may, in inverted commas, slightly be more taxing, working with the EU or trading the EU, will be outweighed by the benefits of trading with the globe. But also allow us to go back to our own rules and regulations, allow us as the UK have our own sovereignty about what sort of food we want to produce, what sort of pesticides we use, what sort of animal welfare rules we want to do. And for me, Brexit was not about just doing what the EU is doing, but actually going better, actually saying we can have a more enhanced rules on animal welfare, more enhanced rules on even pesticides. What sort of pesticides do we want to use in the UK? And offer the world, frankly, a different sort of product rather than just being one of 27/28 countries. So I think those people who are maybe benefiting, some individual companies, are actually not looking at the bigger picture for UK PLC or the global market. The EU market is getting smaller and smaller every single year, where the global market is growing. We need to be paying more attention to the global market, the global trade deals, than the EU.
Kirsty, what do you think of what Alex has had to say? And I suppose that point that's kind of underpinning what I'm driving at here is that there have been years of difficulty under its Conservative Prime Ministers who have tried to make Brexit work. Let's at least give them the benefit of the doubt in there. But actually businesses have reported difficulty. And Sir Keir Starmer is trying to address that. Does he get points for trying in your book?
Well, I'm going to slightly agree with Alex, and I'm going to slightly disagree. Well, not
Perfect.
disagree, but spell out some of what I think is going on here. First of all, quite a while ago, I listened to an interview with Tom Baldwin, who's the biographer of Keir Starmer, and arguably the journalist that knows Keir Starmer better than any other journalist on the face of the planet. And he said something that always stuck with me, because to a lot of extent, Keir Starmer's a bit of an enigma, right? And he said, if you want to know where Keir Starmer wants to end up, look at his direction of travel, inch by inch by inch. And I thought about this week when I see sectorally, inch by inch by inch, something that if Tom Baldwin is right about the sort of man that Keir Starmer is, we're seeing the start of a slow march back into, at the very least, a kind of single market. So I can understand the issue of cries of betrayal, particularly around agri-food. There are issues, very real issues with dynamic alignment. I said last week this was going to be the dog that definitely barked if we signed up to dynamic regulatory alignment, because it leaves us, high-bound by European rules. We are a rule taker, triggering words all coming back, rule taker and not a rule maker. And why that matters, I think, for me, the closest I think the Labour Party ever got to a coherent narrative that makes sense in a modern world is, it's a terrible phrase, but the narrative was right, was around securonomics. Now that means secure borders, it means, secure defences, secure infrastructure. It also means security of food. If you dynamically align us, you let go of quite a lot of the things that we are looking at the moment, which would make our food security much more robust. Things like, genetically experimenting with food to make it more drought resistant, for argument's sake. So there are always trade-offs on this one. It is entirely a judgment call on whether you think that easier access to the European market, which remains our biggest trading partner, is worth losing some of that area of development where we are frankly one of the most advanced in the world. It also might leave us slightly kind of high-bound when it comes to extending those trade deals that we have, particularly with America, possibly with other countries. Those are all kind of works in progress. But where I slightly disagree with him is, look, Brexit was and always will be a sliding scale of trade-offs, right? And the Brexit deal that we were trying to get through Parliament under Theresa May was a deal which made trade as frictionless as possible. That, for a multiplicity of reasons, didn't fly. And for the Brexit purists, and I would argue under Boris Johnson's deal, the trade-off that they were prepared to do was to go, annex off, if you like, easy flow trade into Northern Ireland and build friction into the system as the quid pro quo, if you like, of getting the deal over the line and some of the other benefits around sovereignty and control that comes with it. This cedes back, no doubt about it, in this sector particularly, it cedes back control to the European Court that we had taken back. It cedes back control over farming rules and regulations, but it does give farmers and those that export more frictionless trade. So if you ask farmers, if you ask supermarkets, they'll say whoop-de-woo. If you ask Brexiteers who value the ability to set our own laws and make our own rules, they will call it a betrayal, and it depends where you sit in that spectrum, if you like.
Alex?
Yeah, I think, and I want to pick up the point about food security. He emphasised that food security. Now, to me, this actually is more the deal. It's actually undermining food security, because one of the things we're signing up to on this deal is making us, the UK, more aligned now with the EU carbon markets, their emissions trading and environmental ambitions, which is very much a fast march towards net zero. Now, this is not a conversation now for net zero, but one of the main reasons we in the UK, under the Labour government, are pushing us to net zero is through solar farms, huge amounts of solar farms. And where's the most of that being built now? On farmland. So in one way we're saying it's going to be better for food security in one way, but the other way is actually by increasing some of these targets to align ourselves more with the EU carbon emissions, we actually need to go further and faster probably, and how we go to get to that net zero is probably through solar farms, which take away agricultural land. So it's a bit of yin and yang, a bit of sort of, you give with one hand, you take away with the other. And this is what I think the problem with this deal is. For instance, like I'm sure we'll get onto it, some of the defence system, opening us up to some of the defence market. On the face of it, that is good, that we can sell more weapons, more defence, but we're also going to pay for the privilege of that, and therefore we don't know yet what that cost is. So a lot might look good on paper, like the defence, but then actually how much the cost going, and no one can actually say how much that is going to cost us. And there's quite a few of almost blank checks, or unknown checks, for want of a better word, in this deal when it comes to the SBS, even when it comes to the migration issues, rather, it. We don't actually know the costs of it. So we're signing up to a deal which, frankly, could be an absolute disaster, which I think it probably will be, or it could be just very bad. And I think there is that sliding scale. We don't know where it's going to land. And as a sceptic of the EU myself, I think it's going to be disastrous, because the EU will really, frankly, put every screw on us to get the most amount of money and migration levels. But a person with a more sunny disposition to our European brothers and sisters will probably say, actually, it's not going to be as painful as you think. And this is what concerns me about Keir Starmer. He's come up saying this is a great deal, but there's so much of this deal that we don't know, and still relies on further... I could not even sure it's negotiations. I'm unsure whether some of these payments are going to be a negotiation, or the EU saying, well, this is how much you're going to pay for this access. These are the numbers. And that, to me, is where some of the really concerning element is. We don't actually know the full extent of this so-called, this betrayal.
Yeah, well, okay, so was it, with that in mind, was this the right time to do this? To make these announcements on things like, as you say, this reintegration with the EU's internal energy market, a new security and defence partnership, which wasn't part of the original post-Brexit deal, so that's another part of this, albeit times change, foreign policy is an ever-evolving thing, of course, all of that. And then fishing is the other part of this, but we get locked in on fishing for the next 12 years. But I think it's fair to say it's a continuation of how things have been, is it not? Just for a longer period of time than perhaps had been anticipated. Kirsty's shaking her head. Go on.
Well, look, as I understand it, and as has been briefed into the papers by those that know, our position was that obviously we had this agreement under the Trade and Cooperation Agreement that was due to come to an end next year. There was, I think, our position going into these negotiations was about extending that arguably for another 5 years. Of all of the giveaways where, I think it is inarguable that Europe has come out better, this is it, right? I wouldn't be terribly happy in some senses if I was a farmer, depending on what I'm looking at in terms of regulatory alignment. I would be appalled if I was in the fishing industry, because it has signed us up for 12 years to exactly the same access that we had some leverage on. It's a complete capitulation in terms of the farming industry and the fishing industry. And if I could and Alex is absolutely right about this. It's, dare I say, this Labour government is getting better at spin. Because actually the rest of it, the only things we know for sure is that we've signed up for dynamic regulatory alignment on energy and agri-foods. Now you can argue about, the rights and wrongs of that. We seem to have completely capitulated on the fishing access and the huge, time frame that the European Union wanted it for. The rest of it, Defence and Security Pact, who knows how much that's going to cost, what that will look like, more talks, more negotiations, we don't know. Same about youth mobility. And the e-passport gates, and the ability for us to be able to use e-gates.
We're going to whiz through our holiday destinations.
It's exactly the same as it was before these talks. We've all, every European country has always had the right to allow British passport holders to go through e-gates. It's entirely up to them. All this deal says is we won't stand in the way of it. So the only win so far that I can categorically say we have is on the restoration of pet passports. So great if you're a pet. The rest of it, it's more of a memorandum of understanding than an actual deal, right?
Just trying to buy off the Daily Mail. That was it, really, wasn't it? Because they love an
I
animal.
don't think it succeeded.
I don't think it's
Locked
worked
up
either.
the travelling dog vote.
Exactly.
Go on, Alex.
I just a couple of things. One thing I want to reflect on is, like, you talk about better at spin. I think quite telling that I think the graphic number 10 or the Labour Party or the government put out to celebrate the electronic border games was sort of before this deal, lots of people being angry, queuing up. Then after a deal, a nice family with 2 young children overlooking the sunset. Now, these children clearly are under 10, and any person with children know that unless you get 10, you cannot use the electronic gates anyway. So it's a complete sort of nonsense. Now, on the actual fishing bit, I think, let's be honest, in my view, the deal which Boris signed 4 years ago now, probably the worst thing we did as the Conservatives was fishing. We didn't protect the fishermen, women fishing community as much as we should. It was a bad deal. And I think there was a general belief that next time we negotiated, actually it couldn't get any worse, and actually we're going to get a slightly better deal because we made that sacrifices 5 years ago, and suddenly we're locked into a very bad deal for another 12 years. It wasn't like we made a good deal and we're locked in for 12 years, not going better. It was a bad deal. It was one of those sacrifices I think we had to make 5 years ago to get the deal across the line, and we're now sort of locking it for even more, and that to me is shocking. I mean, we're betrayed, frankly, and we did betray the fishing communities 5 years ago. We didn't stand up for them as much as we should have done. I think there was a trade-off. But now this has been locked in for another 12 years. Imagine if you're in the fishing community, you've had 5 awful years. You now think, OK, at last we might be able to get something, across the line. We might be able to actually improve our lot. And suddenly locked in for 12 years. 12 years after the last 5 years. I mean, that's the best part of 2 decades. And what concerns me, talk about, youth movement, what young people in fishing communities are wanting to really go see a future in the fishing fleets in the UK. It's 12 more years of this. We're going to lose all our fishing communities. We're not going to have anybody in the UK wanting to fish because it's just bad.
Just before Joe comes in, I was just going to flag that the sort of fishing industry is perhaps a good example of the mixed response to all of this, and I'll take 2 sort of organisations in Scotland. So the agreement's been described as disastrous by the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. On the other hand, Salmon Scotland welcomed the deal as a slashing of red tape, and I think that potentially speaks to the difficulties of something like this, and also the different aspects. So fisheries policy is kind of around access to water and then quota shares, i.e. how catches are shared around.
Just to jump into that, as far as I'm aware, and I'm not a fisherman myself, smoked salmon is freshwater, isn't it? And the fishing community is in the sort of North Sea, and that's the concern. So frankly, if you fish salmon, you're not going to be too bothered about what trawlers going off in the North Sea or around Iceland, I presume.
Fair point. Go on, Joe.
I was just going to say the thing that I've found quite interesting is the business community have been pretty positive, and I wonder if you've got any sense around this, Alex, as to whether you feel that they're somehow being duped or that they've been sort of they've misunderstood something, because it's very interesting that at a time when the business community are not particularly positive towards this government, that they came out quite fast supportive of this deal, even though there's so much of this deal that is unknown, as we've talked about. So what do you make of that?
Well, I think we all know the number one thing the business like is certainty, and I think this deal does give a bit more certainty to that. I think we've also got to bear in mind where the business community has always been on Brexit. I mean, look at Stuart Rose, Marks and Spencer's famously leading the lights to Remain campaign, but also that the business community has been so squeezed at the moment for the last sort of year, and with the national insurance rise and the like going on, they're almost, I would say, grasping for any bit of good news to try and actually sort of hold on to anything. They're desperate for even a little bit of good news because they're really struggling.
Alex is also very good at spin.
A politician never.
The reason that the business community are so supportive of this is because it removes quite a lot of the friction that Boris's deal put in. I mean, it was, in terms of trying to secure frictionless trade with your biggest trading partner, a bad deal for exporters. There's no 2 ways about it. That is why when we were trying to secure a deal, and I'm not trying to get into a my deal was better than your deal, it's all a trade-off, right? It's all a trade-off. But that is why we were trying to secure as frictionless as trade as possible, because it would be bad for exporters into the European market. That's why we see the situation that we've got, where there's a pretty kind of uniform agreement that this is good for them. The thing that I'm struggling with, Alex, and I don't know if you can help me on this, the dynamic alignment for energy. Why? I don't understand. If we have an emissions trading scheme, we are, as far as I understand this, and I don't want to get too boring about this, we are going into this negotiation with something that most of mainland Europe really needs, right? Which is great big caves under the North Sea to help people, particularly big countries like Germany, store their carbon, to help them meet their net zero. How did we end up right at the start of this negotiation with what seems to me, a huge chip being handed over to the EU, when we've got something that they need more than anything that they have that we need? This one is a complete baffler to me.
It does seem it's not something which people were talking about in advance either. It's not one of those sort of things that we were done. I mean, I don't know. I think they sort of gave away what they could. I think. Let's be honest. Like, one of the reasons why Keir wanted to put away. Look, he claimed he got this deal done, the American deal done, the Indian deal done. I think, put the spin on it, Keir is desperate for good news, especially after local elections. I'm not saying they rush things through or desperate to get things through, but when it comes to, like, the reports are the fishing rights were given away at the last minute. They want to sell. Look, we're okay on the international stage. We know things are bombing at home. We know that. But look at us on the international stage. We saw this with Keir and like Zelensky and Trump, and there was a small positive poll bounce for that. And I think at the moment he's seeing the trade, the sort of international statesman, is a way of actually regaining some credibility.
Just on that, there's a statement came out from Renewable UK who said, commenting on the agreement, this is potentially great news for bill payers in the UK and across the rest of Europe, as it could drive down the cost of electricity in the years ahead by stabilising prices and reducing trade friction, including trading in clean electricity generated in the North Sea via interconnectors between countries. It goes on, the statement, to kind of explain sort of more about exports and that sort of stuff.
And all that is true. What I'm concerned about, or I don't understand, is why you need dynamic regulatory alignment to be able to do that, as opposed to something like mutual equivalence. It is just baffling to me why you need to sign away, that to acquire that kind of greater interconnectivity.
Sure.
And a huge fuss being made about a document that is full of shoulds and coulds, which is just, I feel like, for anyone that had PTSD from Brexit the first time round, it's just triggering in so many ways, because there are so many points of this. I think the point about Labour spin, there's some significant, we are going to see this summer a bunch of people putting up photos of them being stuck at e-gates. Yeah. And being stuck in queues at airports, and the whole thing will fall apart, because it's jelly being nailed on jelly, quite frankly, because we honestly don't know when this will come in. We also don't know whether it will actually work, because, as Kirsty pointed out, it did already exist. So there is something around this that, I've talked before about the marching of the public up hills. And quite frankly, I still think significant damage was done, because so much of that was done during the Brexit campaign, where people were marched up hills for things they were promised were going to happen that then didn't. Subsequently, several, bad deals were then established, which have caused problems, which is maybe why people are falling over themselves to say this is good, even though it's full of coulds and shoulds, because that's how desperate they are for something to improve. But it's incredible. For me, I've been quite surprised by how woolly some of this stuff is. The claims about cheaper prices in energy, when there are still loads of points about how this is all going to actually work. It is out there, in the same way that this government said that Great British Energy is going to mean that everyone's energy bills are going to come down, and there's no sign of when that's going to happen. So it does worry me that when we know that one of the biggest challenges that this government has got is the threat from reform, and actually all parties have got the threat from reform. And the more that these kind of empty promises are being made and claims being made, counterclaims by each side about what is or isn't achievable, it just seems to me like it's just going to be another way to turn the public off of the mainstream parties and just get more frustrated by everybody.
Joe makes a very good point about, trust, a lot of which, and you're quite right, Joe, a lot of that was caused by those Brexit debates and those Brexit years, and a lot of that was caused, the sense of turning away from both parties and turning off on politics and the political class completely was caused by that. And it's interesting, isn't it, to note that, if you overspin something like this, you'll erode trust further. I think if you rush too quickly for the betrayal surrender button, because it isn't quite... there are bits of it that are problematic, and, there are bits of it where we have clearly handed over and given away more than we, at this stage of the game, have got out of that. But to just go... you could have written these headlines, and you could have written the lines to take from the Conservative Party before the summit had even taken place, right? Whereas, interestingly, if you look at Farage, yes, he's put out a bit of a tweet and stuff about it saying, well, this is betrayal, yada, yada, yada. But he's kept it sectoral in terms of where the betrayal lies, and he's relatively stepped back from the debate. And
that's what he's following France, isn't he?
Yeah, he's that bothered. He's been away and he hasn't come home. He's actually, if this was their big thing, why is he not around?
Or does he sense that actually this is more damaging to get sucked back into the Brexit debate and to move on from it? That is why I suspect
you could be right.
some of what this is about is, he's done Brexit, doesn't want to be Mr. Brexit. He doesn't want to turn off the public with an endlessly stale debate about equivalence and dynamic regulatory alignment.
I think, though, if you look at the political winners and losers, on the UK politics, clearly I'd say reform is a clear winner from this. It'll drive more people in the hand. But I also actually say I think it's not this helpful for Labour. I think, frankly, where the Labour Party is now, they've lost so many of their traditional Brexit voters now to the Reform Party. They need to start more appealing to some of the more, dare I say, middle-class liberal voters, even some of the Lib Dem-facing voters, to actually say, we still hold a candle for the EU, you stick with us. We don't want you going off to Liberal Democrats. They're starting to creep up now, the Greens and stuff. Maybe they're actually saying they've almost given up on the sort of traditional white working class to reform, as we've seen at the local elections, and actually now trying almost a core vote strategy. But core vote is now their sort of North London middle classes. It's hard to know what's going on.
Well, that is going to get very crowded territory, Alex, isn't it? If you end up with Reform trying to court the kind of reluctant Remainer Middle England crowd, and Kemi Badenoch, or whoever might succeed Kemi Badenoch, beginning to think actually that the greater threat is the Liberal Democrats in those blue wall seats, and we are never going to be able to out-reform reform, that's going to get awfully crowded. Lots of people trying to be centrist and moderate and reasoned and serious. How delightful.
How delightful indeed. And on that note, Alex, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your perspective. We're grateful for you joining us.
No worries. Thank you very much indeed.